I'm going to be talking about the way of the Lord. Now, I have two different pictures of this. This is the first one I came up with, thinking about the parting of the Red Sea and all that entails. And we even sang about that a little bit ago, that there is, like, he did that, the awe and wonder of that he parted the Red Sea, and what that was like. One of the greatest miracles we know of biblically was how he delivered them across this seabed, on dry ground even, and how to even capture that or to think about it. The way of the Lord, a lot of times we think about it as this grandiose picture of the way of the Lord. And then I came up with another picture. This is also the way of the Lord. And it feels a little more ominous. But honestly, a lot of what we read in the Exodus encounter is more like this, I think, and sometimes in our own life. They saw the awe and the wonder and the majesty of the parting of the Red Sea, but there's a whole lot more of them. They're not looking at the wonder of God. They're like wondering, okay, God, what are you doing? I'm wondering here, as we're wandering here. And they feel that a lot. Now, thankfully, we don't ever run into that. We're always seeing the Red Sea part, not worrying about it, right? I think it's really fitting to go back to look at Genesis, to read these stories. And by the way, we've been going through the Bible this year, and we're going fast. It's faster than you can possibly comprehend or absorb. One of the things we talked about is the beauty of going quickly. If you do the entire Bible in a year, you're going to be reading a lot of chapters quickly. But what you do get to see is you see the tie-in a little bit more over time. And so I want to grab each week one of the major themes of a tie-in this week. It is the way of the Lord. And we see that in the Exodus story. And we see it from the beginning of where we read in Exodus. We're going to be 13 all the way to 32 is what we covered. So I'm going to go ahead and just read all that. No. It's going to feel like that by the time I get through, I think. It's like, what do I not say? And the difficulty is the more I look at this, I'm like, even this morning I'm looking through and going, wow, that would have been a really cool thing to add. So I have way more notes than I'll actually share. We'll find out which nuggets come out and which ones that you get to today. But the way of the Lord, the thing about it is, how do we know it? How do we understand it? And there's a lot of scripture that talks about that. I want to look at the very beginning where we read this week in Exodus 13 and look at how we ended last week. We talked about the hand of the God and how the hand of God delivered them out of Egypt. Let's read that again, Exodus 13:3. He says this over and over. He said it again at the early part of the reading earlier this week. Then Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you came out from Egypt, out of the house of slavery, for by a strong hand the Lord brought you out from this place. And he asked them to remember that. They were brought out. And so, we'll remember that. Yay, at that part, it's like, yeah, we got all this loot. We're happy. We're out of there. Yay! And they run out the door, and it's kind of like in graduation when the kids run out and they throw the papers in there. Yay! And they're like, oh, but where are we going? It's like, yay, we finished that. But what are you doing next? I have no idea. I remember in 8th grade, I used to watch all those movies where they run out and throw the papers in the air, and I thought that was so cool. And I did that at the end of 8th grade year one time. I had all my folder full of all these papers, and I ran out and threw them all up in the air, and one of the teachers was standing out there, hey, and I had to pick them all back up. So that was not worth it. I was like, I've got stuff I want to go do. I don't even know what it is, but it's not this. And so sometimes it doesn't go the way you see it, the romanticized way and whatever that next thing is. So here they are. They're out of Egypt. They're like, yay, we're out of Egypt. But where are they going next? So we kind of pick it up, and this is where God's way diverges a little. Exodus 13:17-18 tells us a little bit. So when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. He did not take them the short way. God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Oh, he already knew how they would come later on. Remember that story? We're going to read that later. It's like, they're big. Those people are big. But what he did instead was, I don't know that this is easier. He leads them around by the way of the wilderness towards the Red Sea. We know where this story's going too, but the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt. They were equipped for battle. They're ready to roll. They're, yay, we're going, but now they're going this long way. And I think they're okay at this point, like, well, we'll follow Moses. Things have gone well. We had that whole 10 plagues thing, and we were on the good side of that. So, yeah, we're good with this. Moses is great. Things are looking good. Go to the next chapter, Exodus 14, 10 to 12. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, and we've looked at both of those recently. They lifted up their eyes. That means they're like, whoa, they took notice. And then there's that word again, behold. They were a little taken aback. The Egyptians were marching after them. They feared greatly. They were like, oh, well, here come the Egyptians still. I thought we were out of there. The people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, is it because there's no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us? Now he's the bad guy. So they're talking to Moses, bringing us out of Egypt. It's not this what we said to you in Egypt? I mean, we told you. And leave us alone. Leave us alone. If you'd just let us go our way that we may serve the Egyptians, it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than just die in the wilderness. Now, there's a lot of foregone conclusion there. They've been at the hand of these Egyptians. They've been beaten and treated terribly for a long period. They've seen the power of Pharaoh. How quickly have they forgotten these 10 plagues? And this deliverer Moses, who was the hero. Yay, we're out of here. We got the loot. Everything's good. And they turn around and go, oh, well, wait a minute. Why are they still following us? Whoa. Why did you take us out of there? Why did you do this? And why didn't you leave us alone? Why don't you just mind your own business? I'm glad that no one ever acts that way in our world today, You ever share the gospel and someone doesn't want to hear it? I don't need to hear about Jesus. Life has gone bad and things stink, and I know the rest of that story. You say it's going to be good, but things don't always go well, and this is what they're seeing. They're looking on with fear, and they're looking on with eyes of captors, with slaves, with poverty. What they've known, they expect, and they have more faith in that than they do of the God of the deliverance. It hasn't been as long. They've had 400 years in captivity, and now things are going, looks like really well, but they're still waiting for the other shoe to drop. They are captivated by what they feel like was comfortable, at least usual, and the fear of the unknown of what they're going into. This is the problem. They were, I think sometimes we kind of do that. We get a little ways removed from where we were, and then we only reminisce about the good old days. You remember how good it was? Now, what if we could go back then when there was a simple life and we didn't have to deal with the electricity and hot water and indoor plumbing, Those things are just such a bother. We could go back to the good old days. It's funny what we romanticize about. We'll watch a Little House on the Prairie, and maybe we'll see the good side of that. And Ma and Pa are there together and reading by candlelight, and we forget that one of them goes blind and all of that. But anyway, we remember the good stuff sometime. And so they're remembering the good things about Egypt, which wasn't much, but they did. Why don't you mind your own business? We would have been left us alone. Would have been okay. Sometimes we feel that way. Even when someone's trying to help us, we just push back. And I think that's part of the whole idea of where we are in our world today with the whole relative truth thing. Like, oh, that's your truth. You've experienced it, and you have a way of believing what's true. Now, I've experienced it differently, so my truth is different from your truth. The reality is there's just truth. Now, we may have a different opinion about what that truth is, but you can have a bad opinion of what truth is. There are times that people want to say, no, my truth, this is the way I see it, so this is my truth. And that relative truth idea ultimately doesn't work. And realistically, it just leads to even anarchy. It's like if everyone looks at the same thing and will say, I see it this way, I see it this way, I see it this way, Those are genuine different ways that we see things. And that's absolutely, our experiences can be completely different. But trying to define what the truth is based on our experience, we're going to discover that we probably just didn't have the whole story a lot of the times. That's a whole nother sermon for another time. Perspective is a big part of it. God's ways are not like our ways, and that a lot of times has to do with perspective. Now, Charlotte and I were watching this last week, the California fires just keep going and going, and we saw part of it when the fires were raging up the mountains in the Palisades, and they have all those multi-million-dollar homes on top of the hills, and you see all these people out with garden hoses trying to fight it back, and it's just, you see it from this high perspective that they had it, and the fires are raging up the mountainside, and you're talking to your television and saying, put down your hose and run. You're not going to fight that thing back. Now, the giant helicopters and planes and stuff they're bringing it over, throwing water, was doing well, but they were trying so hard, and I get it. And even the commentators, like, it's like they're really not doing much. It makes themselves feel a little better, but man, this fire, they really need to get out of there. And shortly thereafter, you saw the fires come up and take some of the properties. They were able to save some. It's a rough picture. But that high perspective helps you look and go, looking at it like, no, you need to get out of there. You think you're saving your home, but you're probably going to lose your life. And so you just watch some of that. How many times have you watched something going on in someone else's life and you're thinking, I see a direction here. You can't always tell them. In this particular instance, we could yell at our TV all we wanted to. They weren't going to hear us. Sometimes you need a higher perspective, and God's ways are higher. Isaiah 55, 8, and 9 tells us that. Isaiah 55, 8, and 9 says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways. My thoughts higher than your thoughts. So he has a perspective. And it's not just a height perspective. That kind of gives us an understanding of, it's like the time perspective. It's like trying to tell your child that they need to do something now that over time, because they don't have the perspective of time. Remember how long summer was in school when you were a young child? It was years. It was years. Now it's like a minute. I mean, it's just like, oh, do we have summer? It's crazy because the older you get, the more perspective you have. You've lived longer time. It's a smaller piece of your whole pie. And so things just speed up. And God has a perspective over time. He knows. It's even bringing them out. God was not surprised by the way that he would take them. He didn't go, oh, I was going to take them through there, but we're going to go this way instead. He knew what they needed. And he knew, here's the deal. They were coming out of there, and it was going to be an entire generation that did not make it, that perished, if you will, in the wilderness. So, did they not matter? I think they mattered immensely. There was 400 years they were in captivity. I mean, they got to see things that by the direct presence of God that few people on planet Earth have ever seen. They were in the midst of the greatest miracle time of all, and yet they still had so much of that Egyptian influence in that slavery that was part of them. So the ways are higher, we know that, but it takes a real belief in God to believe that in the midst of whatever we might be going through. When there is, in this case, okay, so your plan was to take us to this sea in front of us and bring the Egyptian army, the most powerful force on earth, against us over here. And by the way, you really made them mad. They're mad. I mean, the whole 10 plagues thing, he's not happy. So, is this really the way you wanted to go? Moses, either you didn't talk to God or God is weird. Something's going on, because this couldn't have been a good plan, because we're looking at it and it should be different. Exodus 14, 13 to 14. They're afraid, and Moses answers them, do not be afraid. By the way, one of the most common commandments in the Bible, do not be afraid. Some people have written that it's 365 times. There's debate about that, but it's in there a lot. Stand firm. You will see the deliverance of the Lord that he will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. So it's like, yeah. So how many times, even we read last week at the hand of God, he says, throw down the staff in your hand. He goes, okay, and turns to a snake, and what does he do? He runs away. That seems logical. I think I would too. Like, okay, good deal. You handle that. Here they are again. They're in this fearful spot, and they're not understanding. And Moses' advice is, no. He brought you here for a purpose. What he wants to do is for you to be still, to not fear, to calm down, to sit tight, because he's about to show you something you've never seen before and never will again. You just be still. Know that he is God. This is where your fear needs to subside, because the Lord is bringing salvation today. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. That's your part. But how hard is that sometimes? Faith a lot of times is just stop the striving. Stop running. Stop reacting to the stuff that you see before us. A lot of times it's like we fear, we ask the question, and then we run. That's like we have this emotion. We wonder out loud to God, and then we act on that emotion. It's not wrong to have this emotion of when something comes to look at it and like say, hey, that doesn't look like fun. They didn't have to go, oh, that's really cool. We got the sea over here and the Egyptians over here. Cool, I mean, it's not wrong to not want that. We've talked on several occasions how Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he says to God, you sure? It's like, is this the way? I'm just going to go ahead and ask if there is another way, could we do it that way? Because this on the surface looks rough. But not my will, but yours be done. So he yields his will in the face of that fear. What do they say? Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness in the midst of it to go ahead and act anyway. To go into the face of it, even when it doesn't look like a deal, but I'm just going to trust in the middle of that. So now we move to Exodus 14. If you look through the rest in some of that, it talks about the mighty hand of God once again. And in 14:31, and when the Israelites saw that the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and Moses his servant. So when they see God acting, they're like, oh, okay, the whole mighty hand of God thing again. Okay, so we were good. Okay, that's great. Then they see everything. They see the Egyptians swallowed up. They see God part the sea. Like, oh, so this was, now we get it. You put us between a rock and a hard place so that you can eliminate both, and all glory to you, because we did nothing but sit still and you delivered it. Okay, that's good. We like that. So 15 is about singing songs to God. You get the song of Moses, you get the song of Miriam, the horse and the rider's thrown into the sea. I mean, woohoo! Yes, man, look what God did. Moses is awesome. God is awesome. Yay, he delivered us again. I know we questioned it a minute ago, but we were just, venting, I'm okay now. We're good. 15:22 to 24. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea. They went into the desert of Shur. Oh, sure. Into the desert. That sounds fun. For 3 days they traveled into the desert without finding water. Now, wait a minute. Okay, so now we got delivered from that. Now we're in the desert. So we're hanging on for a little bit. When they came to Marah, They could not drink its water because it was bitter. That's why it's called Mara, which means bitter. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what are we to drink? And now, look, they're grumbling against Moses again, okay? This Moses guy. Man, it's still a sham, okay? Now what are we going to drink? So Moses calls on the Lord in verse 25 right after that. Moses cried out to the Lord. The Lord showed him a piece of wood. Well, of course. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. Well, yeah, of course we know. Just throw some wood in the water. It'll fix it. Obviously, another miraculous hand of God thing. He just keeps doing this. He's showing them over and over again by taking them to impossible places so that they can see the power of an infinite God over and over and over again. They saw all 10 plagues, which you would think would be a lot. Then they grumble at the Red Sea, and then God delivers them, then they're happy. Now they're in the desert, and they're sad again. Every time they hit a situation, they just go back to and they default to, and it's like, well, maybe he's done all that, but where are we now? What have you done for me lately, God? I need you right now, this minute. And so now here they are, and then he makes the water sweet and it's fit to drink. They're like, oh, good. So they're good again. So he takes this context of this bitter water, he turns it to sweet. And by the way, you see a lot of this imagery all through the Bible. You're going to see parting of the waters. You're going to see it in the River Jordan again. You'll see this over and over. They were delivered even before Noah through the waters, and you're going to see that. And that's imagery that you see in baptism. There's so much richness that goes with this. Jesus later turns water into wine, which is like the beauty of, you see this plague where they turn the water into blood. And then what does he do with the water into wine? But he says, now this is my blood. See, because there was a penalty. See how all that attaches, and you can go deep into that. But that's a little bit of a sign. So here they are. They've seen all the power of God. Any one of those plagues would have been pretty impressive. And the Passover deal, yeah, not just hanging out, but actually sacrificing the lamb and staying inside while the firstborn is dying all around. Everything, even livestock. And God is saving you in the midst of all of that. I think that would be pretty powerful. Yet, here they are. It's been, that was in the past. Not that long in the past, but it was in the past. Oh, and the parting of the Red Sea, that was great, but that was in the past. Now here we are, and he's given us water, and guess what? It doesn't take very long till that event comes into the past either. It's interesting, if you go back, you find these story after story after story in the Old Testament. We read not long ago about the story of Joseph. We kind of just ran through that part. But think about Joseph himself. He was this guy that was born into this family, and he went through so much. His brothers, they didn't like him because he had the pretty clothing that Daddy gave him, and he was Daddy's favorite. And so they murmured against him and finally decided to throw him in the pit, debated on whether to kill him, and decided instead they would just sell him into slavery, which he goes into slavery by the Midians, which later is the family that takes in Moses, if you see that connection, that kind of stuff you see. But they are Ishmaelites. They're part of that family. The Midianites, Ishmaelites, they take him and they sell Joseph ultimately into slavery, into Potiphar's house. He rises up. Things go really well there till he gets accused of rape, and then his coat is left behind, which you see this code over and over again. These really amazing things that God shows us over and over again, how God redeems and God redeems and God redeems. But he goes through all of that. He goes from the pit to then he goes to the accusations in Potiphar's house, and then he goes into prison. And while he's in prison, he helps out a couple guys, and what happens? They forget him. So he's still sitting in prison until finally he gets to Pharaoh, and he rises up to full power. And we get to the end of that story where he's the ruler of pretty much the known world at that time. He goes from being left in the pit, left in the prison, left for dead, and it's God uses all that. Here's the deal. If he hadn't gone through all of those things, he wouldn't have ended up where he needed to be at that time. And the last thing that Joseph says to his brothers at the end of Genesis 50, 19 and 20, is pretty cool. Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? I'm not in God's place. See, you don't have to fear me because I fear God more, and so I'm leaving you in his hands. You intended harm to me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." See how he took that whole story and he said, I recognize in all of that mess, God was in control. And you're going to see that theme over and over and over again. I think that Paul is hearkening back to that in Romans 8:28, and he says, we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. See, God has a call on every person's life. And if you follow the good call of God on your life, he can work out even the bad things that are intended by the enemy, because he's always going to accuse you. He's always going to come after you. There's always going to be, we have the good news in Jesus Christ, but there's a lot of bad news in the world. So are we going to fall victim of the continued bad things that happen to us or the bad things that we do and let that be the story of our life? Or will we embrace the good call of a good father that has good plans for us in the midst of all this mess? So now we jump back to Exodus. We got past 15, now we're in early 16, Exodus 16, 11 and 12. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, I have heard the complaints of the Israelites. Say to them at twilight, you shall eat meat. So now we're a chapter further along. Even though they had the good water, they're not complaining about what they're eating. You shall have your fill of bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. This is the beginning of the manna story. And pay attention, a lot of times people miss the fact that he gives them manna in the morning and he gives them quail to eat. So they have meat along the way too, not just the bread. But the other part of it, he goes on to explain to them, okay, pick it every day, every morning. It's going to be there early in the morning. You get enough for your family, but only for the day. Don't keep it the next day because it's going to rot. On the Sabbath, the day before the Sabbath, which you rest on, you can get double that day for 2 days worth because you're not going to gather any on the Sabbath day. And so what happens, they go on to the middle of that story and they don't do what God says to do. And so we jump into the end of 16, 27 and 29. On the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather and they found nothing. The Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and instruction? The Lord's given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you food for 2 days. I've already explained to you, and I told you ahead of time this is exactly how it's going to go, and it went that way. But now you're worried. So you have this poverty mentality that I better go ahead and take. I know he said not to do this, but I'm going to hedge my bet and make sure. Years ago, Charlotte and I, we worked at Girls Town, USA, and we worked with the girls that would be placed there a lot of times by the state, or they came from a bad home situation, something. And a lot of times maybe they were even living on the street or homeless by the time they got there, and they had just had to fend for themselves. Maybe they had parents that just neglected them completely. So they show up and they live in the home, and a lot of times early on, they would take and they would just hide food. They would take it and they would try to hide it and hoard it because they weren't sure. They knew that we fed them well. They got there, they fed them, they had snacks. I mean, there was a lot. But there was this suspicion in them that I don't know how long this is going to last because they had had a different experience in life. And the people that said they were going to take care of them didn't. And situations change, and they're like, I know I'm getting food now, but I don't really know. And sometimes it took a while to realize there's plenty of food. I don't have to go and hide it. I don't have to take matters into my own hand. It's going to be there again, and I can trust this situation. A lot of times it's hard for somebody to trust a new situation like that. They'd been in captivity a long time. So to be fair with them at this point, it's a lot like what we do. We get used to whatever even if it's a bad thing, we kind of can get used to it over time. It becomes our norm. And because it's our norm, it becomes our comfort. And we like things to continue the way that they are. Even if they're tough, it's like, we could have just gone back. In slavery, we knew what was going on. We knew what was going to happen day to day. We could set our clocks by when the guys were going to come by and beat us to tell us to make more bricks or whatever it was. It was a bad thing, but at least we knew what was coming. We like following that plan. We don't want to have to live by faith day to day. God says, I'm going to do this for you. Until they saw it over and over again, it wasn't natural for them. So they had to trust God. They're trying to hoard. They were trying to take care of themselves. They kept expecting to have to do it themselves. He said, I'll tell you, don't keep it. It's going to rot. There's this idea sometimes that there are several people that have written songs about it. There's one years ago by DC Talk. It's The Hard Way. And there are a lot of people that have written poems about it and stuff. There are even sayings about it. Some people just have to learn it the hard way. It's like, I can't, you can just explain it to me. You can tell me the stove is hot. Don't put my finger in the light socket. It's going to shock me. Some people just want to experience it and make sure that that's the truth. Well, I'm not sure you're telling the truth. So let me learn it that way. And they touch the stove and like, oh, I just lost skin on my hands. You were right, but now I know. It's like, wouldn't it have been better to just trust, I stuck my tongue in the light socket. That hurt. Yeah. Probably shouldn't have done it. I could have told you not to do that, but you wouldn't listen, So we do these things. I mean, thankfully, kid growing up across the street from the Hudspeths, I never did anything weird. They would tell me sometimes, that's a bad idea. So sometimes a slow learner, but we get these things. There's a path with the Lord that requires trust a lot of times. Faith and trust go hand in glove. Sometimes we get so used to our captivity, we get complacent in that, and we just default to it. And there's so many ways we can do that. Exodus 17, 2 and 3. The people quarreled with Moses again. Shocking. Said, give us water to drink. They got to a place where they're out of water again. Obviously, they had forgotten that God had done it before. Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? So he's reminding them, quarreling with me? Guys, you're not trusting God. The people thirsted there for water and complained against Moses. And they're like, no, this is your problem, oh leader. Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? See, here they are again. They're like, they still don't trust. Their expectation is, no, you just got us out here a ways off to just, here we are, desert. We're just going to die here. You don't care. No, everybody hates me. We need some worms. 17:7, so they call the place Massa or Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord with us or not? It's like, Moses, all your blah, blah, blah. Here we are, dry in the desert again. So it's really interesting to wonder whether, do they go and ask, or did they just default to quarreling? We do know this is where they end up with. If you've ever raised children, you know that on occasion, your children will accuse you of not caring for them the way that you should. Do you even care for me? You don't love me, Is God even with us? You're not on my side, whatever. They end up getting to this mountain of God, which is Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb we talked about before. This is where Moses met with God in the mountain of God, and that when he at 40, and God said, okay, you're about to go back to Egypt, and gives him that whole plan. So now here they are. They're back on this mountain, and God is going to give him the words. He said, you're going to go and you're going to do all this. And it's going to take a while, and you're going to come back, and you'll be here. Now he's back. They're at the mountain of God. God gives him, what does he give him? this 10 commandments, right? In fact, he doesn't give him just 10, he gives him 613. We hear about the 10 a lot. That's the top 10. It's kind of like a late night with David Letterman, the top 10, it's not, but that's not the end of it. There's a lot that comes with it. And we'll be reading some of those laws. And sometimes it's just staggering to read through all these laws. And sometimes you're like, why is that a law? Well, they were weird if they had to be told not to do that. And remember, they've been, again, 400 years in captivity. They're basically Egyptian at this point. They've been just saturated with all these false gods. They've really tried to stay themselves. That's why they set up in the land of Goshen to begin with. I think it's kind of a beautiful thing that when they first come in, when Joseph comes in, says, hey, tell them you keep livestock, and they're going to give you this land of Goshen because that's where all the livestock are, and you guys will go take care of that, because they hate that, and they think it's nasty, and they'll be happy with you doing that. And because of that, that's where they are all this time, and so they're having to take care of all these animals, but that's who they are. They are shepherds. They take care of that, and that actually keeps them secluded from being part of this Egyptian society in many ways. Some of the Egyptians actually come in to be part of them. And, of course, some of them go over to be part of and want to be part of the Egyptians. And there's a lot of crossing over. You can imagine in 400 years. It's going to do that a little bit. But they've been down there for a while. And they are saturated with this culture. And so even though God has set them apart for a long time and they've had a process, there's still a saturation of who they are. One of the things that God tells them in 19, I think, is really interesting. This really talks about the heart of who God is, what he's always planned, and where he's going with them. Exodus 19, 54 and following. So look at this. So you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenants, you shall be, and this is what God wants, my treasured possession among all the peoples. For the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. We biblically see multiple places when you are a chosen generation, a holy nation, a royal priesthood. This is a recurring theme, and this is what God says, this is what I've always intended for you. A kingdom of priests. Which is weird, because kingdoms are ruled by kings, not priests. But that's what he wants. See, the priesthood is about this whole thing he's about to set up with all these laws. And they're shepherd-type laws, by the way, with the livestock, because there is death and sacrifice necessary to pay for all of these sins. So he begins this process here's what he wants. A holy nation means this. Holy, the word holy, one of the best words to use for holy is to be set apart for a purpose. That's really what holiness is. We think of the cleanliness of it and such, and yes, it is. And there's a purity about it, but it's set apart by God for a good purpose. So you are a chosen, holy nation and a kingdom of priests. This is how I see you. My treasured possession. God sees us as his treasure. This is what he's doing for the people. In Exodus 20, just a little bit after that, verse 19, the people told Moses, okay, you speak. You speak with us, and we'll hear you. But let not God speak with us, lest we die. So here they are at this mountain of God, and there's already been a history of this mountain. They've called it that for a long time. That's where the burning bush was. They understand where they are. And by the way, they're looking up into this mountain, and the top of it's on fire. And, I can imagine what all it looked like. It was thunder and lightning and fire and not consumed, or what all was going on. And God told them, look, you don't, touch the edge of the mountain, you're going to die. So, yeah, it's definitely kind of a scary place. And so they're like, hey, you know what? I know they say we're a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, all that, and God said that. But I tell you what, why don't you go talk to God? We'll hang out here. You be the priests. And by the way, if we already told you how much we love you, Moses, you're such a good guy. And you just go up there where it's on fire and have that conversation. You've done it before. I mean, have at it. We'll hang out here. It's really funny how when they need a priest, oh yeah, you're the priest. We want some representation. Why don't you go talk to God? Because we really don't want to do that. See, there is this thing in us that we recognize, and it came from the garden from the very beginning. What does the accuser come and do? You're not fit to be in the presence of God. You are shameful, you are sinful, and what happens? They're like, you're right. And they go in their exposure, they say, we realize we're exposed, we're naked, and we're ashamed. We realize our faults, we realize our problems, and we don't want to be in the presence of a holy God because we have kind of seen some of that judgment before. And I tell you what, why don't you go as a representation for us? We'll hold back. People like to have priests in that regard, but God had intended from the Old Testament a kingdom of priests, a people to have access to God, to be holy, because he's created them that way. This was his intention all along. They did not want to risk that presence. You get a few chapters of all the laws, and the laws some of them are pretty wild, really. They're, don't touch this, don't do this, you should do this. And if you do that, then this is what has to die in order to cover that. There are layers of different ways that we sin. And there are all kinds of different ways that God says, this is the retribution for that. Because the wage of sin is death. If you don't want to die, then you're going to have something sacrificial in its place. He's already showed them the sacrificial lamb that was necessary. When they came out of the Garden of Eden, he clothed them in animal skins. The first sacrifice was whatever he killed to cover them. I'm guessing a lamb. And he covered them in that skin, and that's the first death we know recorded. So death is a consequence of sin. He told them, don't eat of this. The day you eat of that, you shall die. Death is the ongoing consequence of the ongoing sin of humanity. And we're all in that boat. The law is set up by God to show that there's a law of sin and death. In fact, Paul goes into deep detail about the law of sin and death in Romans. And he sees, for this sin, there's death. If you don't do this, that is a sin, and the penalty is death. If you do this, that's not good, it's death. If you were supposed to do this and didn't do it, that is also death. In Rome, Paul's like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I know what I'm supposed to do, and I don't do it. And I know what I'm not supposed to do, and I am doing it. Who will deliver me from this body of death? There is therefore now no condemnation for those that are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus sets me free from the law of sin and death. So you need to understand the law of sin and death so you can understand the grace of God. It's hard to know the good news of what Jesus did for you unless you understand the bad news of what we have done and who we are without God. And the love that God had, and the understanding that the missing part of that relationship is not that God abandoned Adam and Eve, but it happened the other way. And he gives grace all along the way. And the whole reason this law of sin and sacrifice is there is because God is willing to give grace through sacrifice where sin should be unto death. He gives a place of sacrifice. So that law sets up so we better understand that when Jesus comes along, how he fulfills all of this sacrificial stuff that has to go on. So then you get into this description of the tabernacle and all of the things that go into the tabernacle. And if you read about that, and there's a lot in here, and we'll read about it in other chapters as well, so much of it is a picture of what the Garden of Eden looked like, what was meant to be in the presence of God. You get that again in Revelation in the future of the redemption of what it will be like to be redeemed by God. But there's a cost and a penalty and a sacrifice for all of that to get back into the presence of God. See, they were locked out of Eden, but now he is trying to make a way where there seems to be no way. How do I get back in the presence of God without just dying? Because I know I don't deserve it. And not just to have a high priest to go in my way, but to be part of the kingdom of priesthood that God has intended. You know, both in the Hebrew and the Greek, the word sin is to miss the mark. I've gone into detail on that in the past, but in both languages, it's to have a target, to aim at it, and to just miss it. And there are lots of different reasons we miss that, but that's what sin is. We had a pastor years ago, one of the churches we served in, and he did pretty much the same same sermon every Sunday, and he always included this line: there are sins of omission and there are sins of commission. All right, that means there's stuff you should do and don't do, and there's stuff that you shouldn't do and do. This was what Paul saw as the problem, and we still all run into that. And all of these sacrifices are to help. You didn't do that, this helps get in place of that. You did do that, you shouldn't do that, stop doing that, do this in place of that. And there's always a path back so that there can be cleanliness back in the presence of God. This in Exodus 21, it is kind of one of the main scriptures. Exodus 21, 23 to 24 is one of the key scriptures that talks about, kind of sums up some of the law. But if there is harm, you shall pay life for life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, a stripe for a stripe, and it goes on and on and on. Interesting. I like even that this definition or this translation here talks about a stripe, because we later get that by his stripes we are healed. And it is by his wounds that he covers over our transgressions. How amazing is that? That there was a sacrifice necessary, but that is really what he did in place of these sacrifices that were necessary. In fact, in Matthew 5, I'm going to kind of skip through a little bit of these, but this is Jesus talking about summarizing that law and hearkening back to it, and says this. Matthew 5 and a few verses, I'm going to kind of bullet through here. Jesus said, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye." There it is. A tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, when someone hits you on one cheek, you turn the other cheek. Whoa, 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 whoa. That wasn't in there before. Oh, what about this? If someone says, "Go with me a mile," you go the extra mile. Oh, whoa. Okay, you're making this harder. You've heard to love your neighbor. I say, love your enemy. So Jesus not only takes all of his impossible law, but he says, let's double down on that. You've heard it said that when you have adultery, it's a bad thing. I tell you, if you even think about it, like, whoa. If you look at someone with hatred in your heart, you've murdered them. This is already hard. Now you're taking it way into the impossible. The rich young ruler comes to him and says, "What do I need to do?" And he gives him a few of the commands. He says, "Oh, yeah, I did good with those." He says, "Okay, well, cool. Then just sell everything, give it all up and come." He said, "Wow, wait a minute." Because he had a lot of stuff. Sometimes we don't want to come because, what am I going to give up? Sometimes we don't want to because we fear the possible, because we've seen bad and we think bad may happen. Or things have been really good and we think we may lose the good. One of the problems I think we have a lot more so in the United States is not the fear of the captivity. I mean, I don't know how many of you have ever been in slavery by Egyptians and beaten daily to build bricks. I've not had to do that. I probably would fall more on the rich young ruler side. We've had enough stuff that we're afraid that we're going to lose our stuff by following God. It's just as much of a problem. So here's Jesus. He said, look, all of these rules, you think those are hard? No. And then the disciples come and go, "I don't know if we could do it either." And he says, that's the point, guys. It is impossible. But what looks impossible with humanity is completely possible with God. You're in the Red Sea and the Egyptians are bearing down on you. Where's your faith in the midst of that? What about the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace? And there's another story. And don't forget this part too. They're about to go in there, And they tell Nebuchadnezzar, like, you know what, just go ahead and throw us in the fire. I don't know if it's going to work out right or not. On your side of things, we might just burn up. But that doesn't change the fact that God is with us. It's kind of like, Paul's like, I live here now and I'm helping people out and I'm telling the good news. But if I die, that's a win too. Because for me to live as Christ, to die is gain, and you can't come against me. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fiery furnaces, like, he might just deliver us. Go ahead and do whatever way you want to, but either way, God is still God. Sometimes it doesn't look like we win. Every apostle except for John was martyred. And you look back at that and you go, hey, I'd like to be Peter and walk with God and then get crucified upside down. Yay, But he saw that as a blessing, even unto the end of his life. And where are we? And what do we feel like we're giving up? What are we trying to hold on to? What are we trying to build with what we have? Matthew 8, 1-4. When Jesus had come down from the mountain, a great crowd followed him, and there was a leper who came. This is after he does this famous sermon. Knelt before him and said, Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean. Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said, I do choose. Be made clean. Immediately the leprosy was cleansed. By the way, if you're going to read through the law, you're going to get a lot about leprosy and cleansing rituals. Very important. Jesus said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone. Go show yourself to the priest. Offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. See, a whole lot of the law is about cleansing rituals. A whole lot of the law is about healing. And much of the law is about forgiveness. This is what Jesus comes and to do. He cleanses us from whatever we've had. He heals us. And he gives forgiveness. And he does that in story after story. In fact, one time he forgives. And they're like, hey, whoa. You can't forgive sins. That's of God. And he says, not only do I forgive your sins, but I also tell you to take up your mat and walk. And whoa, you're doing that on a Sabbath. And there's always something wrong from a law side. And Jesus is like, look, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this as a testimony. And I want you, even in this particular case, is like go and show yourself to the priest, and we're going to fulfill that law. So you'll see what's going on. And this is early on. It's like go and show them the cleansing and the healing, because he's going to let the other cat out of the bag too. There's also forgiveness, because he has the power of God to do these things. Exodus 23, and this is... and several little verses here. I'm going to read a little bit. Behold, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way, to bring you to the place I've prepared. I will not drive them out. This is interesting. Before you in 1 year, unless the land become desolate and wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little, I'm going to drive them out from before you until you've increased and possessed the land. So God's going to go ahead and send them into the land in the latter part of Exodus. Like, I want to go ahead and tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to lead you with an angel, a messenger, and you're going to go in, you're going to take possession of the land. But I'm not going to just go ahead and do it really quick. You're not ready for that. I'm going to do this slowly by slowly. I'm going to get Egypt out of you before you go into the promised land. Now, we got you out of Egypt. I've got to get Egypt out of you. It's like you can take the kid out of the country. You can't take the country out of the kid. This is what he sees. He's doing it because he knows better. They're not ready. But he's going to go ahead and take, because he loves them so much, he's not going to give them that responsibility until they are ready to do it. And then Exodus 29, 45 and 46. I will dwell among the people of Israel, and I will be their God. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them up out of Egypt, out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. His whole purpose, his whole plan is always to reestablish a relationship. The whole thing about building the tabernacle, he goes into all this detail about everything that's necessary to build this tabernacle. And what is that for? So he could have a place where they could have contact with the Holy God. And he does that by creating this priesthood. and all that has to go into that. There's so much detail of what it takes to enter the presence of a holy God. And then he fulfills it all in Jesus Christ. If you look at that layer after layer after layer, you read in the book of Hebrews about how he is our high priest. All of that is built upon what's going on here in this Exodus story. And we really need to get into the nuts and bolts of what's going on so that we can see the value of that, of what he's done ultimately and has done for us in Jesus Christ. How beautiful is all that story, and you see it as it unfolds. And we'll continue to read in Exodus, and we will see some more laws. We'll read Leviticus with some understanding of the power of what God is doing there. And I pray that you guys will be able to keep up. And if you can't, just keep going wherever you are. I just want to encourage you to do some of this reading. And if you're not there and you want to skip over and catch up where we're going next, do that. Just stay in God's word. Because what we said a lot of times is it's one thing to read a book that has good information in it, but the beauty of the Bible is it really reads us. And every time I read it, I'm always finding new stuff. And I've read, Charlotte and I read through many times. We spend a lot of time together. And I pray that you also have discussion with others. One of the beauties of that is getting together and you have questions. And you should. There should be many questions. I can't tell you how many times Charlotte and I have been sitting and we're reading along. We're like, have you ever seen that before? Like, no, that's crazy. What does that mean? And you have to cross-reference it, look it up, and go, oh, okay. Because just like he did with the people going into the promised land, he just doesn't give it to you all at once. You're probably just not ready. And every one of us, if Jesus had to grow in wisdom and stature and favor with God and men, then certainly we will too. So my prayer is that we will leave here today and we'll continue that growth path, that we will have a hunger and thirst for his righteousness more than the things of this world. We recognize that we need food and water and shelter and all the stuff that they fought for, that we need to get away from our captivity, and we need to not rely on our stuff, but to rely instead on God who loves us. Amen?